Good morning, church. Today we're going to be talking about 1 John chapter 3. This is a challenging chapter in that it sets up this dichotomy between those who love God and abide in God and those who love sin and abide in the devil. It says very starkly that those who abide in God do not continue in sin, and those that do practice sin are not of God. And it was always a challenge in my heart, especially as a young believer, when I would read that and say, well, there are these areas of sin in my heart. Does that mean that I'm not of God? Does God expect perfection? Do those who follow after him live a perfect life? And I don't think that that's what John is talking about. I think what he's trying to say is, as we abide with God, it's a pursuit. It's a walk with God towards who he's created us to be. And so what does that walk look like? What is the practical life that means I do abide with God? Well, in verse chapter 8, he says, whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. So when God comes into our heart, we're going to see that as if on a battlefield or over the course of a long war, there are victories here and here and here. The boundaries of sin in our heart are being pushed back. Then in verse 9, it says, no one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him. And that makes you think of what Paul says in Galatians about the fruit of the Spirit. We want to see God's fruit growing up in us more and more. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those ought to be multiplying in our lives. We'll not always be perfect, but that's the fruit that's growing more and more. That's the evidence in our lives. And ultimately, John points us back to his main theme, loving one another. He talks about Cain, who did not love his brother, who in fact went as far the other direction as possible to kill his brother. And that's where all of our sin leads us, is to death, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. It brings pain and suffering to the people in our lives. Whereas if we're abiding with God and pursuing righteousness and seeing his fruit grow in our hearts, then what we see is that we build up the people around us, that we help them to grow. Verse 17 says, if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? It means that if you have fruit growing from God, even if you have physical resources, food, shelter, clothing, money, these fruits in us, the righteousness of God in us, the love of God in us, will drive us to bless others with whatever things we have, spiritual fruits, gifts from God, and material wealth. These things will be poured out of us because that's what it means to love and abide with God. So what does it look like to not be one who practices sin, but one who practices the law of God? It's to love, to be growing in righteousness and spiritual fruit, and to be pouring out those blessings all the time into those around us.